Hello, loves. I'm Sarah Gomez, and you're listening to Romancing the Story, a podcast about romance writing, reading, and finding love in story structure. We're at episode number 15. On today's episode, I talk with Kelsey Holmes on writing styles, brainstorming, and surviving NaNoWriMo. With that said, let's dive right into the episode.
Well, no one likes editing their own writing or anything.
Absolutely true. That's very true. It's hard to kill your darlings.
Mm-hmm.
Ugh.
Definitely.
Welcome, friend of the library, editor and research investigator, Kelsey Holmes. Yay!
Hello. Hi. Thanks for having me.
So you are the owner of Kraken Editing and have a very special skill set in services, right? That include research and brainstorming that I haven't seen very many editing services offer that. Can you kind of tell us more about it?
Yeah. And it was interesting that you said that you hadn't really seen research specifically in other editing services, which I have also seen. And I think like one of the only similar items that I've seen quite frequently is people will research for like plagiarism, or you may reach out to a specialist in a field, and so that specialist will like fact check you. So those are some similar fields that I've seen, but for research and why I chose to provide it as a service, I know a little bit about a lot of things. So, like I graduated from a college. I've got my bachelor's in humanities, which means that it's a fancy liberal arts degree. Like that's kind of when I first coined that term. Like I know a little bit about a lot of things because I basically just cast my net and was like, I need to know everything. And so that's what I did in college. Yeah.
Ooh, that is a hefty agenda.
Yes. But also it very much comes naturally to me. I'm one of those people that is endlessly curious. I find everything interesting. And if I find something new and interesting, or if I want to learn some more about something, I will dig into it. I hyper focus and I drill in and I'm like, I have to know everything about it. Additionally, I collect information. I kind of joke that like, that's my dragon's hoard, but I share it. Like, I don't keep it, I share it. But
I love that.
Like, I love the internet because it provides so much information for free. And I bookmark everything. Like I curate my bookmarks endlessly. Like every few months I'm like, okay, I've got to like go through and check these all again. Unfortunately, like being this person that knows a little bit about a lot of things, that also makes me the friend that always says, did you know? And then proceeds to go on a tangent to everyone because they'll mention something or they'll ask a question. And I'm just like, I have knowledge that pertains to this and I have to share it. Even if I'm unfamiliar with a topic, like I love learning and I'm so curious, like I'm happy to dig in. Like I don't want to talk about my current editing project, but it is on an industry that I'm very unfamiliar with. And I was just like, just reading it and I'm like, oh man, this is really interesting. And now I had to like go on a little journey of discovering all this information just because I was curious.
And now you have to go on a Google search and just make sure it's just like, I want to know more.
I know. I kind of have to joke because everyone has that online meme about like your NSA friend or your FBI friend that's on the other side watching your Google history. Yeah. And I'm like, please don't judge me. Like, don't worry about it. But that's very much me. As for the brainstorming side of things, that was one of those skills that I realized I had as I was editing, because like I only started my business this past year, but I've been editing for a long time. Like high school, I was peer editing. College, I was once again peer editing, but on a different level. And then as I was getting older, I was editing in my work. I was editing for my friends. And at the time, I thought nothing of it. One of the things that I realized, and then a specific friend pointed out, was that I ask questions of the writers that to me, they're very obvious, but to the writer, they're not. And so they're extremely helpful in the writing process. For example, one of my favorite series of questions to ask writers that are working on fantasy or speculative writing is the religion in your book real with a capital R? Like, you as the author should know, is it actually, does it exist or does it not? Or does it not matter? And then I follow up with that, like, does anyone in the universe of your story know the answer to that? And if so, what do they do with that information? And that's one of those things, like, some writers just don't think about that. And I'm like, well, it may not matter for your story, but it could take your story in a really interesting direction if you decide it does matter.
Right. And I think sometimes as writers, we don't see the forest through the trees necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's really important to have at least someone to go to bounce those ideas off of. Either it be, and brainstorming, you're right, it's a skill. It's a total skill that you have to know how to manage and who to go to help you figure those things out. We do have like one of our writer friends in our group. We go to her because she's our brainstorming kind of savant, and we're like, fix it, help us fix it, because she'll ask those questions. And I love it when you have, like I said, when you can go, you have a special skill set and you can use that to help authors.
Yeah, because brainstorming is very much like the way I approach it is ask a lot of questions, and it kind of ties back into my curiosity and my research, is because, like, I want to know the answers to those questions. And so, like, I may be reading a friend's work and I'm just like, but why? And so that'll lead us, because I'll make them in a friendly way. I will make them answer these questions, and I do get a little interrogative. I'm like, but I need to know. And some people find it more helpful than others.
No, but it's always important too to like realize how your world works. Exactly. Because that's one thing. The one thing as a reader that'll take me out of a book quicker than anything is when you break your own rules, or like I don't understand the workings of the world.
Yes, I'm the exact same way. Like, some people will just kind of go with the flow of it, but I'm like, for me, I'm very literal and very logical. And so I'm like, but it needs to make sense. Even if the answer is just an amorphous magic or what have you, that's still an answer. It's when it's too, like, spread too thin that I'm just like, but once again, but why?
Exactly. So I have to ask, since we are near the end of Preptober, are you participating in NaNoWriMo this year?
Yes, I am. I signed up. I announced my project last week, which basically just meant I logged in, and, like, the way you announce it is you just, like, say, yes, I'm going to write this thing. And then you pick up, like, okay, yes, this genre, maybe. You give it like a soft title.
Yeah.
And just, that's how you announce your project. But yes, I'm planning to do that. We'll see how it works out.
Me too. We're going to see. Fingers crossed.
Wonderful.
So how do you plan to manage writing this year? And is it different than years prior?
Yeah, it's definitely different for a lot of reasons for me, because just like everyone else, like, a lot has gone on this year, and none of us are sure what's going to happen next. And for me, I'm in a very different place now than I was in the past, even just as recently as last year. Because in the past year, from like December of last year, I've moved to a new city. I've started a new business, and I've gone through a lot of personal growth. And all of that has, even though we've got all this stuff going on, like, me personally, I'm in a pretty good place. And so I'm a lot more confident in myself and my skills this year. I'm not dreading Nano as much as I have in the past. I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm just like, yeah, I've got this. And hopefully it works.
Yeah. And what a difference confidence can make. Like, as far as like your skill set, or at least if you've conquered a smaller mountain, like I know I've, like you said, I'm in a way different place because of just the whole year and everything that's gone down. I'm in a way different place than I was last year. And I feel like I can do anything.
It's so weird. It's like kind of bizarre because you're like, you see all this stuff going on, but you're like, man, I'm doing pretty good. I'm proud of me.
Exactly.
And it's a little weird, but it's good. But yeah, I don't have a schedule yet for Nano, because that's one of the things that Nano itself always says, like, you need to have a schedule.
Well, see, and that was the thing I was actually going to ask you about. I was going to say, like, do you follow kind of, because I know there is a whole set of like prepping that they kind of like hand off to you.
Yes.
So I was going to ask, like, do you use that? Do you kind of just wing it? What do you think as an editor?
As an editor, because I'm getting a later draft. Like, it's okay if you send to me your first draft, but it's going to take a lot of work. So maybe do some self-edits first, but you don't have to. But I do think that planning is helpful, but something that the Nano folks have kind of coined the terms is planners, pantsers, and plantsers. So for those that don't know, planners mean that you plan what you're going to write. Like, you outline it, you develop it, you've got those pictures on the wall and all the strings connecting them, and you know what's going to happen. On the other side, pantsers means you're flying by the seat of your pants. You have no plan, or you may have just a little inkling of a plan, but you're just gonna kind of wake up every day and write whatever you feel like writing. If you're lucky, or if you're planning to, it might be the same novel, but it doesn't have to be. And then the third one is plantser. I hope I'm saying that right, which is the combination of the two, which I have kind of learned that's what I am. Because I used to think I was a pantser, but I found out that that's only true when I'm writing like flash fiction or short fiction, because I don't have to put as much planning into it. I can just be like, here's my idea and just run with it. But then, because Nano is 50,000 words, I'm like, okay, like, if I want to see this through, I have to plan. To hit that 50K mark, I knew that I needed to attempt to be a planner, so kind of leave my comfort zone of flying by the seat of my pants. For that, like, Nano, on their website, they do have like Nano Prep 101, which I did actually find pretty helpful.
Okay.
I always say, like, if the way they have it laid out works for you as a writer, like, go for it. That's perfect. But if it doesn't quite jive with your process, like, don't stress out about it, because the way they have it laid out, it's develop a story idea, create characters, plot, strong, like, build your world, and then the last two steps are like organizing your life so you have time for writing. But if you're just doing the story, that's a little different than my process, because I enjoy character-driven stories. So I always think of the characters first. And I have an idea of like, okay, this is my character and this is a situation they're in, and then I build up around that. And so I skipped to step 2 and then went back to step 1. But then I know plenty of writers that they get an idea for a world they want to write about. So they would do it in a completely different order than I would.
And that's a great point. I think I really do, because I have all these plans, right, to write all these books.
Yeah.
Always, right, as writers. So we have like a ton of like a big backlog of, we're going to get to that book later.
Yeah.
I'm going to write that one later. But I feel like my process is going to be different. And I've talked to my writer friends on the podcast who have mentioned that with every book, their process is different. because sometimes it's a different genre, or again, like you said, sometimes it's plot driven, sometimes it's character driven.
Oh yeah.
And whatever the book is necessitates how you will plan or go about it.
Yeah, because I found, like, especially if you are writing a piece of, like, hard, it leans heavily on, like, genre. So the genre story beats, and, like, what you're like, okay, I'm gonna write a romance. Like, you almost have to start with that idea first, because that can, you don't have to, but it can help you develop your characters, especially if you're a young writer, meaning that you are still early in your writing career, not necessarily that you are physically young. Because I hear that term thrown around a lot, and being a very literal thinker, I was like, but you're not young. And then I was like, oh wait, they mean somebody that hasn't been writing their entire life. Yeah.
Kelsey's spicy. You're not young.
Well, because when I hear young, I think like teens and younger, and so I was like, but you're an adult.
True. Oh gosh, like our age, we're thinking like those youngsters, and they're like 19, 20.
I know. They're babies. They're all babies.
Oh, I know, right?
It's a problem. I always feel bad because I'm like, I'm not trying to undermine you. It's just like, that's how I affectionately think of you in my mind, is like, you're all babies, even though you're like 19. Like, but to me you are.
Like, you think you're like, I mean, I know I understand you're going to college, but you're still just a baby.
Right.
You have so much to learn. Don't worry.
Oh yeah, I know. It's just like, it's fine. Don't stress out, because you remember back at that age, and you were just like,
everything was
about everything.
Yes, everything was so stressful. The world was ending every other day.
Yeah,
because of something.
Yeah, just anything. It could be like, oh well, I spilled something on my favorite shirt and I can never wear it again. That was the end of the world. And then you're like, now that we're older, it's
class. Like, man. Yeah, I know, right? I'm late for class. I'm like 5 minutes late for class. I'm freaking out.
Yeah, that was, I had a lot of anxiety in college.
Oh, I did too.
Oh God, it was terrible. Yeah, even though I'm a person that loves to learn, I hated school. I hated it.
You know what? My husband's the same way. Like, I could take it or leave it, to be honest. I kind of learned by doing stuff, really.
Yeah.
You too? Yeah. And see, my husband's the same way. He hated school. He loves like coding and things like that. Like, he loves to learn stuff and work and like figure it out himself, like more intuitive.
Yeah.
But I think that's important to know, kind of to your strength, as far as like how you learn best. That sometimes that'll affect like what you write about and how you write.
Oh yeah, definitely. Because it's really interesting seeing different personality types and different like learning types, and seeing their approach to writing. It's very fascinating, because like every writers have their own quirks. And so that's definitely been like one of my favorite things that I've experienced in writing, is like, just every time I pick up something from a new author, a new to me author, I'm just like, man, this is really cool, because you're learning like this little tidbit of information about the writer. Because like when I edit, I do like a little intro interview just to we get to know each other and make sure we're a good fit. But then once I have their project in my hands, it's fascinating to me, because just like, to me, they're like accents. So everybody kind of has their own accent, and it changes regionally. And I feel like writing's very similar, because like sometimes you can tell like the age of the writer, like general age, like where they are in their life by the language they use.
For sure. And
then I've run across it several times, because like, I'm from South Texas, and so I've lived in several different parts of Texas. I've lived in East Texas, I've lived in Central Texas, now I live in North Texas. And even just changing, like, well, Texas is big, so they are pretty big distances, but it's still Texas. But even changing those, I kind of have to shift the way I communicate with people. And then when I met my husband, he's from the Northeast. And that was definitely an experience because there were a few times where he would just kind of like tilt his head and look at me and be like, what did you say? Because of turn of phrase. One of the examples that we always kind of joke about is, at least in South Texas, when you're doing the dishes and they're clean, what do you do with them? You put them up. Yeah, you put them up. Or if you're cleaning your room, you put up your toys. Okay, well, in the Northeast, they don't say that. When you say put up something, they think you mean literally put it up high. So he was so confused for the longest time because like we had to have an entire discussion. And once I realized it, I shifted the way I spoke in that regard because I realized I was like, oh, I'm being unclear, which when you're in like the writing business or the editing business, you kind of have to be very clear with your language. But right. I had never thought about it because that was something that everyone around me understood that, okay, put up the dishes. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Because everyone around here uses it. Mm-hmm. Of course. Well, one thing I did too, like one time I went to a summer camp and I remember we had this big old discussion because it was one girl did not understand. I was going to the convenience store to go grab some Cokes, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know where the story's going.
You know exactly where this is going. When you say Coke,
yep.
I meant like, I'm going to give me a Dr. Pepper because everything's Coke.
Yes.
I asked, hey, does anyone else want a Coke? Mm-hmm. And all the girls were putting in their orders. One girl said, oh, I'll take, she's like, no, but I'll take a Pepsi. And I was just like, oh, okay, I'll get you a Coke. And she's like, no, I want a Pepsi. And like, it was just a back and forth.
Oh, no.
Like, I was like, no, I'll get you a Pepsi, but I just mean, it's like a Coke. Uh-huh. It's like, we just call it every soda is a Coke.
Yeah.
Every soda.
That's one of those I had to learn. I feel like I had to learn that one relatively early because I kept getting frustrated when we went out to restaurants as a family. I would say like, yeah, I want a Coke. And then they thought that was my order, but I was not communicating effectively, apparently. Oh, yeah.
That. Yeah.
Just those little weird language idiosyncrasies.
I know, right? And that's very interesting, too. Mm-hmm. And especially, too, because I had an editor friend who actually edited from someone who was overseas. So he didn't know any of those idiosyncrasies. Mm-hmm. So he would say things very formal. Like, and she kind of had to, because his story actually took place in California. He was from England.
Okay.
And so and the slang you did use didn't really work. Yeah, because he learned it all from American television.
Yeah.
Like, that was kind of how he knew it. So he kind of, and not like all the procedurals, basically. Yeah. That's what he watched. So he tried to use a vernacular, and she would have to write on, basically send him notes saying, I don't know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Or how you're trying to say it.
Yes. And that's a great example of why, and this is something I've come to learn is like, if you are wanting to be published, like, yes, you're going to have to get an editor. Even if you're self-publishing, you still need to get beta readers at the very least, which are just people that are going to read it and give your opinions on it. Mm-hmm. But you need to get, when you're doing that stage, try and get people that are familiar with the content you're writing, even if it's just the genre. So like, I would have suggested for this author, like, hey, do you like know anyone in California? Or maybe the editor knows people in California and they could get some other people to read it, to provide input. But then that also, like, that can go into the whole sensitivity reading has definitely, like, it's been around forever, but now people are kind of shining the light on people that have that specialty of being sensitivity readers, and people are selling that as a service, because that's something that I feel most responsible authors and writers should attempt to do if they're writing about something they're not familiar with.
Right. And I think it's really important as a writer to have like other diverse writer friends, like just like from other cultures, backgrounds. It doesn't matter like where they're just different walks of life.
Yeah.
Like,
well, and just like, just like with the put it up example, like I wouldn't have known that was an issue if I hadn't had somebody that was unfamiliar with it tell me.
I completely agree with you, because I don't know if you listen to any of the podcasts, but I went on a whole tangent just because it made because here's the thing. I'm Hispanic, and you can tell from the Spanish in the book, you can tell from the culture that the author who wrote the book, it took place in Texas and in Mexico, and it didn't really make sense, like culturally. It would have changed the whole context of the book, because spoiler alert, her bad guy, who she had said was Hispanic the whole time, is actually white. And he was adopted by and when I say adopted, I don't mean like as a kid, I mean as a full-grown adult. He was kind of brought into the Hispanic family. I believe that. I can believe that. We'll bring anyone in the family. You know, mi familia now, you know.
I'm from South Texas, so I'm like,
So but they treated him better than their own blood, which would never happen. Never happen, ever. So like, it didn't make sense in a cultural sense. So
like even when you marry in, they're still going to call you gringo.
Exactly. We still call my husband that.
It's like, we love you, but you're still white.
Yeah, you still the white boy.
You're still the white boy.
You're still the white boy. Sorry.
Yeah. It's just that's the kind of stuff where it's like, and it's not even a difference, because I see, especially with how accessible self-publishing has become, a lot of people like to put the blame on that. But we see that in professionally published, like big publisher books. Like there's an entire subreddit devoted to men writing women poorly. No. And it's just like, come on, like do some research, and maybe if you're going to write that, maybe have a woman read it and give you some feedback. But that's just a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, and especially if you're a woman, you should always have, like, it'd be great to have female presence, yes, in your book. And if they're prominent, it behooves you to have some kind of research behind that. To have a female reader read it and say, hey, can you give me some pointers here? Where am I lacking? Or where can I make this more realistic?
Yeah. Yeah, because I know, like, especially when you feel like you're ready to publish, sometimes you're not ready yet. Like, kind of ignore it for that first bit. But that is definitely the time when you need to evaluate, like, who have you had read your work to give you that pre-published feedback, because that's the kind of stuff that can make or break your book, like can make it successful or not, because just like you said, like it can only help you to have a diverse readership before you publish, because it can only improve your book. But yeah, I'm already, like, my project for Nano, I'm just in my head, because you can only do so much research on your own, but I'm already, like, tallying up stuff I need to research afterwards because I don't have time to research it now. But I have a very diverse cast, because I love diversity. I'm like, why would I do, like, the same old boring stuff? But I know, like, I'm going to need to get some sensitivity readers involved, because, I'm not a gay man. I'm sorry. Like, I'm just not. And so, so I'm going to have to get some people that are in that demographic to read it. As a fan fiction reader, we fall into those traps of, like, because it's written for fun. And so it's not always super serious, and especially the majority of it and a lot of the older stuff is very, like, Harlequin. It's very, and so, like, because it's just entertainment. You're not supposed to be, like, analyzing it and writing a thesis about it. And so, because I grew up reading that, and I still do, I'm like, okay, I've got to be, like, I gotta put on my like professional writer's suit.
Well, and you bring up a great point, because I had another podcast like all about fan fiction, because I am a former fan fiction writer.
Yeah.
I mean, I still might dabble in it if I feel I want to.
Yeah.
But like, I think it's a product of what we grew up with, you know, reading all those other, like maybe Harlequin romances or the other fan fictions around at the time.
Yeah.
And they weren't really, it was more about just entertainment. Like you said, nothing about like actual research behind it. I mean, we would just like, you know, yes, this happened in this vague, undefined way.
Yeah.
And that worked. That worked for what it was. But so that I think too, and I've always kind of promoted this, not only on my podcast, but like with other writers too, is kind of read other genres or read outside your comfort zone, at least, you know, even if it's still within your genre, you can still find other pieces of literature, like other books, other novellas inside that same genre that's outside of your comfort zone that you can kind of maybe learn from.
Yeah. Well, and that, I'm glad you brought that up, because I used to look down on quote unquote romance because I saw a lot of the like teen focused like sitcom shows, and I was just like, oh, it's so dumb. And then I like, and because that was what was easily available, and I didn't like a lot of the romance I was able to get a hold of in the aughts, in like the late 90s, but I was also that was my younger days, so I probably shouldn't have been reading my mom's historical romance novels anyway.
I mean, we all did it. We all did it.
It's fine. But and it wasn't until I realized when I was older, because I've been reading fan fiction for ages and ages, like decades at this point, that I realized, like, even though I go in certain fandoms and I like certain tropes and certain genres, my favorites are what are technically romance, because I love the happy ending and I like the relationships. Yeah. And it's just like, and it was kind of like this realization. I was like, oh man, I've been trashing on this genre this whole time. And then I realized, I was like, I love it. Like I'm still very picky because I like, and it's become more easily accessible in the publishing industry because it's getting more progressive, but I like diverse casts. I like, I don't mind, like I like tropes. They're enjoyable. There's a reason they're tropes.
Of course.
But I was getting tired of kind of the same old story. But nowadays we've got, what was it? Like there was a book that came out recently, or like last year, called Red, White, and Royal Blue. It's a typical romance, and it's a royal romance, but it's also a gay romance. And so I was like, oh, it's something different.
Yes.
That I hadn't seen yet, that wasn't in the erotica section.
I know, right? I mean, I love those, like, don't get me wrong, I love those too, but like, it's, you want to see, like you said, different, like, I always look to see, do they have like a group of people that are like my friends, you know, like you try to have different types of friends because you don't want to get inside an echo chamber, basically.
Yeah.
Like, and you just get that same feedback loop. It's important to have other points of views and to hear other voices as well. So I always look to see, like, in my writing, am I having a cast of people or a cast of characters that are kind of reflective of, you know, my friends and kind of the diversity among us, or even among the writers. Like I'm involved in several writers groups, and like we have everyone from different cultures to different countries to differently abled. Like all across the board, and it's really enlightening to things you wouldn't think about before. Is like top of mind now. One of our friends who's actually a playwright, and he runs is a playwright society, but he's actually in a wheelchair. So like anytime we have an event, the first thing we ask is it wheelchair accessible? That is the first thing we ask, and that's the first thing we think about. another friend too is very sensitive to lights. So we always ask people, please don't use flash or the camera. So it's always important to have those different voices so we know what to think about as far as if someone has any kind of condition, or we want to include someone who has a different kind of background.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that, like I've said before, but I love the internet. There's a lot of bad that comes from it, but I love the internet because for me, like I grew up in a really, really small rural country town, like very small. And it was predominantly, because it was South Texas, so predominantly Mexican, like first, second, third generation. And then there was, I was the minority because I was white in South Texas. So it was a really interesting upbringing. But then like when the internet happened and we got dial-up.
Oh, yes.
And I got on there and you start, I think part of it was reading fan fiction for the first time and being like, oh, wow, like a gay romance can exist. And this was little baby Kelsey. It was just such an epiphany. I was like, oh, wow, this is a thing that can happen. And it's not bad because growing up in, South Texas, it's very conservative. And I was just like, hey, this is neat. So,
I like this.
Yes, I like this. And so for me, like, it's been super informative. And I love that people that may not have necessarily had a voice or a way to share their voice in the past can now do that, and they can reach other people. And it's incredibly uplifting because like we've got this boom of diverse fiction that's coming out and nonfiction as well, but it's just like all these authors are now comfortable publishing, and the publishing industry is comfortable selling like these diverse casts, being like cultural, racial, their relationships. Like we've got like they're also no longer restrained to the fantasy genre, because it used to be you could almost only find those in fantasy genres or science fiction, because they could be like, oh, well, it's an alien culture, or it's part of it's magic. It's not real. But now we're getting into like contemporary fiction and mainstream romance, where we have gay couples, we have poly couples, which is a huge deal, and we're even going into like asexual relationships.
I was about to say the same thing. Yeah, some ace representation is happening too. I'm hearing that.
And it's just really, really fascinating. And we're just seeing a lot more positive representation as well, because now that people have their voice, or if that's not their voice, they're aware of the community and where to find it. So that's where that sensitivity reading comes in, and they're like, hey, I want to write about this, but I don't know anything from personal experience. And then they are still able to elevate those voices with the help of people that it belongs to. And it's just, it makes me very happy. Oh yeah. Just
me
like,
too.
Let's celebrate it. It's wonderful.
That's a great thing. And I love that you mentioned too, that like sci-fi and fantasy was kind of where it was restricted before, because I believe I read the first actually interracial kiss on TV was Star Trek.
Yeah.
So like that was the original, the OG, the TOS. So that was the first like big, like interracial like kiss. And it was again, science fiction, but I love that they are branching out. You can you're seeing, like you said, more and more of different types of voices, different types of characters. I love seeing different types of characters in these novels, and kind of learning all about them and their backstory. And it has become more empowering too, from people who may not have thought they could be authors before. Yeah. It's helped something that is personal or more related to them in a more broad way.
Yeah. Well, and in this past year, like 2020 and 2019, I've seen so much because Tor, the publisher, has been like really on board with diversifying their authors, which is fantastic. But like we saw some really big, Gideon the Ninth was a science fiction novel that came out this past year. And the tagline was lesbian necromancers in space. Like 10 years ago, that would not have sold, but it was a bestseller.
That is amazing.
It was a bestseller. And it blows my mind, like seeing, it's once again similar to fan fiction, like we saw it grow. And so you see it like kind of trickle in, and you're like, oh man, like, okay, some people like this, like small publisher, like it started out with small publishers, the indie publishers, because they were the only ones that would do it. And then eventually like the big publishers were like, oh yeah, hey, there's some money to be made here. And then they took that chance. And then we're now seeing the fruits of the labor of these authors and these literary agents that have been really pushing, because they're like, no, there's a market for these books. And just like, I am still blown away with how popular and successful that book was.
That is incredible.
Because like, yeah, the tagline is just the lesbian necromancers in space. And
what's not to love?
Yeah, I'm like, well, thanks. Yeah, sign me up.
Sure.
Yeah. But yeah, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I would definitely say that, yeah.
It would not have been a bestseller. I don't even, Tor probably would have published it, but it would have been like one of theirs, like, we're going to slide it in. It's on the shelves.
Yeah, there you go. Just very, very stealth mode. So that kind of brings a question to mind, though. So like if you, and I don't, like, depending on the content of your book, or maybe you see because I know we touched upon publishing earlier. So thoughts about like self-publishing versus like traditional publishing, depending on your book content.
And that's one where the author needs to do their research, because you will know what's best. Because you will need to research, like, who are the publishers out there. You're going to need to look at price ranges, because publishing can, like, the whole process of writing a book from beginning to end can be very expensive. Like that's a big reason I've seen that a lot of people have decided to self-publish is financial. I've also seen that people that are they've sent out their queries, they're looking for publishing, and they've been worn down by too many rejections, so they decide to do self-publishing. But then I've also seen the other side where people, that's their first choice, is self-publishing. And I think it really depends on your circumstances and what you're trying to write. Like maybe you're really active on social media and you already kind of have a following. Well, you've already got a fan base there. You've already got a market there. So that would be a very safe bet for self-publishing, because you can self-market. Like self-publishing versus big publishing it's just so dependent on so many factors. I would never advise that one person definitely do one over the other, because it's so much, it depends so much on personal circumstances. But I would say, like, self-publishing has become so easy and so streamlined, because Amazon has really done a lot on their end to make it easier for authors to self-publish. Like, they have their own software out there. They've got this, like, they've got their own system, and they have all these guides on like how to use that system. So it's very user-friendly. Whereas, like, if you're wanting to do big publishing, there's a lot more involved, because you have to get a literary agent. You've got to, either way, I would suggest you get an editor, but that's just me. I've also read a lot of self-published stuff that wasn't edited. So yeah, I definitely recommend you at least get it edited once, please.
Oh, please. Yes.
Just please.
Please.
I highly advise it.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, it's just so dependent on so many factors. But either way, like, I don't think it can really hurt you to attempt to get big publisher published. Or even just any kind of publisher, to have someone else do it. It can be an indie publisher, like maybe if you're doing a really if you really like a specific publisher, it doesn't hurt to try. Like, because maybe they really like it and they really want it, and that will just work. That'll work well for you because they're going to do most of the legwork for you.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I've heard of a lot of different writers doing either going one way or the other, but I'm hearing a lot too of hybrid. Of either they're both traditionally published and do some of their own self-publishing with different series.
Yeah, because I've seen a lot of people, because it's really difficult to get, like, now is not a great time in the publishing industry for anthologies if you're not an established writer, like an established successful published author. It's difficult to get into a physical published anthology of like short stories or poetry or whatever. So I've seen a lot of people kind of revert back to that tried and true Zine system that we used to use for fan fiction, and in fandoms they now do it for self-published anthologies. So people will do like short stories, poetry, and what have you, and they'll just self-publish it, and they just get with like a group of their writer friends, and it's still, the quality is just as good. It was easier to get it done because it was such a struggle to get it done through traditional publishing. But that's a relatively, like, that's just like the time we're in right now in the industry. It's just that self-publishing is the route to go if you're not a tried and true, super successful author, if you want to do an anthology.
That's true. And then too, at least it's self-publishing, you can kind of share the cost a
Yeah.
little bit with like the other authors, if that would help you, or if you're maybe just kind of, like you said, kind of fledgling writer too, and you have friends who you kind of share maybe readership, or you would share readerships in the same genre.
Definitely.
That could be very much something that is an opportunity for you there.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
As an editor, how has that changed or influenced your writing?
Oh, it has changed it a lot. Like, it's amazing how much I've noticed the shift in my own skill and my own process. It's really, really interesting. I definitely think it's made me a stronger writer, because even though like most writers self-edit, you're working in a vacuum. But when I'm editing other people's works, like most things in life that you experience, like, it's easier to see things and issues when you're removed from the source. So for me, that's especially true in editing and writing. Like, it's easier for me to see issues in other people's writing and understand why they're issues. And it was really interesting because I was, like, a while back, I was editing a short story for a friend, and because I was like really critically thinking about it and I was in my editing headspace, and then later I was writing my own stuff and I caught myself self-correcting the same issues I had seen in their writing, and I was like, oh, whoa, like, it was such a weird thing, because I had unintentionally learned that I had a bad habit because I saw it in someone else, and I was like, oh boy. Like, so it was very exciting, because it did help me identify some issues. Like, you're never going to get rid of all your bad habits as a writer. Like, I am definitely, I think my two big issues as a writer are passive voice, which is a pretty common one, and purple prose. I get too flowery in my language. But those are things that can be addressed, and sometimes they're appropriate. It's fine. But yeah, it was really, really interesing.
Yeah, it's so
seeing that.
Yeah, and when you see those things, it's hard to unsee them.
Yes. Oh my God, it was it's crazy.
Yes, I do the same thing, because I've noticed, like, I've never met an adjective I do not love. And so and then once one of my friends, my editor friends, pointed it out to me, I was like, I cannot unsee this now. I see it all the time.
Well, and one of my other bad habits is I use a lot of commas, which that's one of those things that when you're shopping around for an editor, you want to make sure that you are on similar wavelengths, because it depends on what you're writing, but I tend to write how I speak. So like if there's a pause, that's where a comma goes. But like the editor will have to end up making that decision and that distinction of like, okay, that's too many commas or that's an acceptable number of commas. Like you kind of, the editor will figure that out. And then at the end of the day, you are still the author. So you get to make that final decision of like, no, I love all these commas and I'm going to keep all of them or not. And, but yeah, it's really, really interesting. Like seeing in my own writing, structurally and technique, like how it's evolved just because of, and even like taking my editing to a professional level because it's now my business. So I'm more professional with it rather than like when I was editing for my friends and I'm like, oh, it's very much like an eye opener. And I very much feel like it has improved my writing because I've seen, I kind of had to make that mental shift of like, no, this isn't something someone's writing for fun. This is something they're hoping to get paid for and that lots of other people are going to read. Right. So it makes a very, very clear shift, at least in my thought process.
Right. And then what a difference that makes too, to think about it in a business sense of somebody wants to pay to read this as opposed to just being thrown up in the great ether of the internet and just like seeing what happens kind of thing.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So since we touched on NaNoWriMo earlier, what are some great writers' blockbusters? That's how I would term them, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of suggestions. So to get the ball rolling, because that's something that I definitely struggle with, is like making myself sit down and actually start writing. Because invariably it's that blank white page that every writer knows, that struggle of like, what do you do? Like, what is this thing? We're the ape with the stick. It's just like, what do? But one of my favorite tools is to use a random generator. There are so many of them online. And you can choose from, like, there are just so many. I actually have a blog post that is about like how to develop a story idea, and that's one of my points, is use a random generator, because my process is like I'll pick either usually like a plot generator or a story, like a writing prompt, which is usually just a sentence or a phrase, and I'll just click it until something catches my eye, and I'll just keep clicking, and maybe I don't like the whole idea, but I like part of it, and that's what I'll start with. And so I just pick that idea and I'll just go with it. Like the idea or the example that I wrote about was when I was clicking through the prompts when I was writing this post was, quote, "A farmer buys the name of the double agent," end quote. That was the prompt I got. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then the thought process that follows that is because, like, okay, you're intrigued. Yeah. But how do you work with it? And so that's when you start asking yourself questions. And that goes back to like my brainstorming service, is these are the questions that I would be asking you, the writer. Like, okay, what reasons would a farmer have for buying someone's name, let alone a double agent's? How would the farmer buy a name? Like, is there a currency system involved? Is it a barter system? Is it magical or is it practical? Like, is it their legal paper name, or is it some kind of magical transaction? And then why would a double agent even be interacting with a farmer? Like, these are the kinds of questions that I like to ask myself when I'm using a plot generator, because people like to kind of trash on them because they're just generators and they're random. But I'm like, they can lead to some really interesting stuff. And I always tell people, like, don't restrict yourself unless you're doing that specifically to challenge yourself as a writer. You don't have to follow it exactly. Like, you could maybe just the words secret agent sparked your idea, and so you just start writing about a secret agent.
Yeah. Like my mind's going wild. Like, how would you use that? Like, how, and like what genre? You could do any genre. Like, there are so many different ways you can spin that.
Yeah. And that's its own challenge, is like, okay, do you write in a genre you're comfortable in, or do you twist it and write it in a completely different genre? Like, how different would that story be if it was a supernatural story versus a like romance story, or maybe it's like steampunk versus like realistic historical. Mm-hmm. Like, how would that change the story and the world and the rules of the story you're telling? And so that's why I love random generators, because they just get the ball rolling and I just run with it. My other suggestions, like, because that's to get you started. Right. If you're already writing and you get stuck, which is very, very common, like especially in the muddy middle, like we all get stuck. Yes. And especially like if you're just not, like if you get up to write that day and you're not in the zone, and especially for Nano, like you've got to meet, if you're going to try and get the 50K by the end of the month, you have to write so many words a day to meet that quota. And I posted about this on my social media pretty recently, but one of my favorite tricks is that when you get stuck, just start describing everything in the scene. You can start with the character, describe what they're wearing, describe how they're feeling, what they look like get really detailed, and then expand out. So like what space are they in? Are they in a room? Are they outside? What's the weather like? What's in the room? Is there, like, if they're in a kitchen, okay, what's on the table? What color is that cup? Like, really start digging into the details. And then you'll find yourself, like, you'll either run out of things, or you get tired of writing, or maybe you reach your word count and you're just done for the day. But usually that gets the little mental juices flowing, and you just keep going and you proceed with the scene. And I still, like, because some people are like, well, it's just wasted writing. But I always say, like, no writing is wasted, because even if you end up scrapping all of that overly descriptive information in the editing process, one, you might end up keeping some of it. And two, maybe while you were writing, you discovered a detail that helped you write something later. Like maybe that mug on the table ended up being important later. Or maybe something that the character was wearing is important later. And so you may not have had that epiphany if you hadn't sat there and described everything, because you wouldn't have thought about it. Right. You're like, oh, it doesn't matter what he's wearing.
And I think too, sometimes our subconscious tells us, our subconscious knows what kind of story we're trying to tell. And sometimes, like you said, if you start describing things and later, like one of the best examples I can think of is, they do it a lot in the Dresden Files. Like in chapter 2, they will put a gun like on a table. Yep. And then like at the very end of the book, like chapter like 40, all of a sudden that gun comes into play. Like, or something else, something very important that was kind of like a breadcrumb in the beginning is later becomes a huge point later, a huge plot point, or maybe a turning point or something that is vital for the character later on.
Yeah. And that makes for really, really good storytelling, because it makes we've all had those moments when we're reading or when we're watching something where that thing comes back up and we're just like, oh man, like I remember when that thing showed up way back when and I didn't care about it. Or like, there have been instances where people will, after the fact, they realize like, oh, that thing did show up earlier. And then you go back and you read, or you find it in the source, in the material, and you're like, oh my God, like the author, that's kind of like those big brain moments of just like, they planned it and it was so And then you find out later the author was just like, yeah, it sounded good, or they didn't even realize they planned it because they were just like writing and it worked.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are always really important just for like good storytelling. But I also, just hot tip, if you're writing a thriller or another genre that is very high stakes and high emotions, so like thriller, suspense, some horror, doing those kinds of like breadcrumbs is incredibly important.
Yes.
Because they will shock you later. And they keep the tension high. But in the example of the gun, if you're going to introduce something, and we use the example of a gun because like, what are guns used for? Shooting things. Yes. So you know there's high stakes involved.
Absolutely.
Whereas if it was like a pencil, you'd be like, it's just a pencil. But then look at examples like John Wick. Okay, exactly. He used a pencil later. So that was important detail. So even though when you're initially writing it, it might not seem that important, you can make it important later. So
that's a great, I love those tips because those will be very helpful during Nano.
Yeah, definitely. Like I have to remind myself, I'm like, but I'm the one that said the tip. Like I need to follow my own advice.
I need to remember these for later.
I know, right? Yeah.
Where can people find your services and how can they connect with you?
Yeah, my website is krakenediting.com. And to make it super easy, I'm also on Twitter and Facebook with my username is Kraken Editing. And if you end up forgetting those or want to see where else I am on the internet, if you go to my website, I have all my social media links on the top left corner. So it's super easy. But yeah, I'm most responsive on Twitter and Facebook, but feel free to @ me or DM me. Let me know if you have questions, and don't be afraid, like, feel free to just ask me general questions. Like I said earlier, I love learning, but I love sharing the information as well. So even if you're just like, what is an editor? You can ask me that question. It's okay. Like I'm definitely one of those people of like, I'm not gonna give you a hard time if you think, like, if you're asking a question that you think is stupid, don't worry about it. Ask me anyway. And even if you ask me a weird question that I don't have the answer to, because I haven't researched it yet, I may know someone, or I can point you in the right direction, because maybe there's some information that I have not delved into and I'm not interested in for whatever reason, but I know where to find it. Right. So yeah, feel free, hit me up with questions or check out my website if you want.
Thanks so much to Kelsey Holmes for joining the podcast. Book recommendations for this episode: Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, and Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. And if you'd like to stay up to date with what I'm working on, be sure to follow me at Romance the Story on Instagram and Twitter. As always, I hope you'll be healthy, stay safe, and take care of yourself. Bye!